The grand hall was bathed in golden light, shimmering with the elegance of a wedding that seemed to have been plucked straight out of a fairy tale. Every detail, from the towering floral arrangements to the soft strains of a live orchestra, whispered of luxury. The bride, dressed in an exquisite white gown, radiated a beauty that could only be matched by the joy that sparkled in her eyes. The groom, a self-made millionaire, stood tall and composed, his tailored suit reflecting his status and success. For the guests seated in neat rows, it was the perfect day, a celebration of love, wealth, and unity. But not everyone was convinced. As the officiant's voice echoed through the room, reciting the age-old vows, a nervous energy began to ripple in the air. The groom, though outwardly confident, glanced at the bride with a mix of emotions, as if silently wrestling with a truth he hadn't yet confessed. The guests, oblivious to this inner turmoil, waited eagerly for the moment when you would say the all-important word, yes. That's when it happened. Just as the groom opened his mouth to speak, a young voice pierced the silence. Wait. The single word, spoken with all the urgency a small child could muster, froze everyone in their seats. Heads turned in unison, searching for the source of the interruption. Standing at the back of the hall was a little boy, no older than 8, his chest rising and falling as if he'd just run a marathon. He looked small and out of place amidst the grandeur, his oversized shirt and scuffed sneakers a stark contrast to the glamorous attire of the attendees. The boy's gaze was fixed on the groom, his wide eyes filled with something between desperation and determination. "You can't say yes," he said, his voice trembling but loud enough to carry across the room. A murmur spread among the guests like wildfire, confusion and curiosity mixing with the shock of the moment. The bride's expression turned from delight to disbelief, while the groom's face drained of color. He stood frozen, his hand clenching the edge of the podium as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Who is that boy?" Someone whispered, "Is this some kind of joke?" The officiant, clearly caught off guard, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Young man," he said, his voice firm but kind, "this is a private ceremony. You need to leave." But the boy didn't move. Instead, he took a tentative step forward, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I have to tell the truth," he said, his voice cracking. "He's my dad." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and even a few disbelieving laughs filled the space as the weight of the boy's words sank in. The bride looked at the groom, her face a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "What is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The groom didn't answer. He seemed rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the boy as though he were seeing a ghost. It was a moment that felt both endless and fleeting, the kind of moment that could shatter lives. The boy's eyes began to fill with tears, but he didn't falter. "You promised you'd come back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "You promised." It was a simple statement, but it carried a depth of emotion that silenced the room once more. The groom finally broke his gaze, looking down at the floor as if the weight of the boy's words was too much to bear. The bride stepped back, her hands trembling as she searched her fiancé's face for answers. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. "Who is this child?" The groom opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The boy, meanwhile, stood his ground, his small frame radiating a courage far beyond his years. And just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any thicker, an older woman emerged from the crowd, her face pale but resolute. She placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder and looked directly at the groom. "You thought you could just walk away," she said, her voice low but filled with an undeniable strength. but the past has a way of catching up to you. The room felt like it was holding its collective breath, every pair of eyes glued to the unfolding drama. No one knew who the woman was or how she fit into the puzzle, but her words carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. The groom's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. The look they exchanged was brief, but spoke volumes. The bride, now visibly trembling, turned to the older woman. "Who are you?" She demanded. "What is going on?" The woman took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving the groom. "I'm the boy's grandmother," she said simply. "And I think it's time everyone here learns the truth." The whispers among the guests reached a fever pitch, but the groom raised a hand, silencing them instantly. His face was a mask of pain and regret as he looked back at the bride, then at the boy, and finally at the older woman. "Please," he said softly, his voice cracking for the first time. "Not here. Not like this." But the boy stepped forward again, his small hand reaching for the groom's. "You have to," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. "You can't lie anymore." And just like that, the illusion of the perfect wedding came crashing down. The groom, the bride, the boy, and the mysterious older woman stood at the center of a storm of emotions, their lives intertwined in ways that no one in the room could have anticipated. What was the truth that the groom had been hiding? How did the boy and his grandmother fit into his carefully curated life? And most importantly, what would happen next? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The silence in the room was deafening, as if the air itself had been sucked out. All eyes were on the groom, waiting for him to explain the little boy's words. But he didn't speak. Instead, he just stood there, shoulders slumped, as though the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. The bride's hands trembled at her sides, her knuckles white as she gripped the delicate lace of her gown. "Please," he said, her voice barely audible. "Say something. Tell me it's not true." But deep down, she already knew the answer. The way the groom's eyes darted to the boy and the older woman, the guilt etched into his features, it was all the confirmation she needed. She felt the ground beneath her shift, her carefully constructed future beginning to crumble. The boy's grandmother, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Her face was lined with years of hardship, and her voice was calm but firm. "You've hidden this for long enough," she said, her gaze locked on the groom. "It's time for the truth to come out, for everyone's sake." Finally, the groom spoke, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I didn't know he'd come," he said, his eyes darting to the boy. "I didn't want it to happen like this." The bride took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean, like this?" "So it's true. He's your son." Her voice broke on the last word, the pain in her tone cutting through the room like a knife. The groom swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes," he admitted. "He's my son, but it's not what you think." The boy, still standing bravely in the middle of the chaos, looked up at his father with a mix of sadness and hope. "Why didn't you come back for me?" he asked softly, his words hitting the groom like a blow to the chest. The groom looked torn, his emotions flickering across his face, guilt, regret, and something that looked like shame. "I didn't know how," he said finally. I thought you'd be better off without me." The grandmother's voice cut in, sharp and unyielding. "Better off without you? Is that what you told yourself to justify walking away? Because I can promise you, that boy has spent every day wondering why his father left him." The bride, now visibly shaking, stared at the man she thought she knew. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "We've been together for years, and you never once mentioned that you had a child." "I was afraid," the groom said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought if you knew, you'd see me differently." that you'd walk away. Tears streamed down the bride's face as she took another step back, as though trying to put distance between herself and the painful truth. "And what about him?" she asked, gesturing toward the boy. "Did you ever think about what he needed? What he deserved?" The boy's grandmother placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but her eyes never left the groom. "He deserved a father," she said. Instead, he got questions and silence. The room was unbearably tense, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone. The guests, who had come expecting a joyous celebration, were now witnesses to a moment of raw vulnerability and heartbreak. Some looked away, as if unable to bear the intimate pain unfolding before them, while others watched with morbid fascination. "I wanted to come back," the groom said suddenly, his voice filled with desperation. "I thought about it every day. But then life got complicated. I was trying to build something, to make something of myself. I didn't think I could be the father he deserved." The grandmother's expression hardened. And in the meantime, he waited. He waited for a father who never came. The boy's voice, small but steady, broke through the tension. "I just wanted you to be there," he said. "I didn't care about money or success. I just wanted you." The groom's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his son. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. I want to be in your life now." The bride, still reeling from the revelation, shook her head. "Now? You want to make it right now? What about everything you've already broken?" She paused, her voice softening as she added, "How am I supposed to trust you after this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The groom looked at her helplessly, knowing there was nothing he could say to undo the damage. The boy, too young to fully understand the complexities of the situation, looked between the adults, his face etched with confusion and sadness. Just then, the grandmother stepped forward again, her voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said to the groom. "It's about that boy and what kind of future you want to build for him. You can't undo the past, but you can decide what happens next." The groom nodded slowly, his expression one of resolve. He turned to the boy, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "I'm so sorry for everything," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I've let you down in ways I can't even begin to explain, but I want to make it up to you. If you let me, I'll do everything I can to be the father you deserve." The boy hesitated, his small hands clenching nervously at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might reject his father's plea. But then he nodded, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "Okay," he said quietly, "but you have to promise." "I promise," the groom said, his voice filled with sincerity. The bride, watching the exchange, felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Was it hope? Or was it the realization that the man she thought she knew was a stranger after all? As the tension reached its peak, the officiant, who had been standing silently this whole time, cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said gently, "this is a moment for reflection. A chance for everyone to consider what truly matters." The room fell silent once more, but this time the tension was different. It wasn't just about heartbreak and betrayal anymore. It was about choices, what had been made, and what would come next. And as the guests slipped on, they couldn't help but wonder. Would this family find a way to heal, or had too much been broken to mend? The room felt heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with anticipation. The boy stood there, his father's promise still lingering in the space between them. For a child, trust was a fragile thing, and though his small nod had shown a glimmer of hope, it was clear that years of absence couldn't be erased with a single apology. The bride, struggling to process everything, finally broke the silence. Her voice was softer now, tinged with exhaustion. "What happens to us?" she asked, looking at the groom. "You've made your promise to him, but what about me?" "About the life we were building together." The groom's eyes met hers, filled with regret and uncertainty. He hesitated, knowing that whatever he said next would shape not just their relationship, but the lives of everyone involved. "I love you," he began, his voice trembling. "And I meant every word I ever said to you about our future. But I can't move forward with you until I fix what I've broken. Until I prove to him, and to myself, that I can be the man he needs me to be." The bride blinked back tears, her expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "I don't know if I can wait for that," she admitted. "This isn't just about a promise you didn't keep. It's about trust. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The groom nodded, accepting her honesty. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I hope someday, you'll see the man I'm trying to become." The bride turned her gaze to the boy, her face softening as she watched him. Despite the chaos and heartbreak of the moment, she couldn't ignore the innocence in his eyes, the quiet longing for something he'd never had. "Take care of him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're going to fix this, do it for him, not for me." The grandmother, who had been silent for the last few moments, stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You've got a lot to prove," she told the groom. "Words are easy, but actions are what matter. This boy needs stability, not just promises." The groom nodded, his resolve hardening. He looked at his son, a faint smile breaking through the guilt and regret on his face. "I'm going to do this right," he said. "I'll prove it to you, to all of you." For the first time, the boy smiled back, a small tentative smile that seemed to light up the room. It wasn't the smile of complete forgiveness, but it was a start. As the guests quietly began to murmur, unsure of whether to stay or leave, the officiant spoke up, his voice calm and measured. "Perhaps," he said, "this isn't the ending anyone expected. But maybe it's the beginning of something better, a chance for healing, for honesty, and for love in its truest form." The bride turned to the guests, offering a shaky smile that was both apologetic and resolute. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But this wedding isn't happening today. Sometimes life takes a turn we don't see coming. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen." One by one, the guests began to file out, murmuring their support and well wishes. The once grand hall, filled with the promise of a perfect day, now felt quiet and intimate, a place where truths had been revealed and new paths were beginning to take shape. The groom walked over to the boy and knelt in front of him again. "I know I've missed so much," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I want to make up for it. Starting today, how about we go get ice cream? Just you and me?" The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding, his small hand reaching out to take his father's. The grandmother watched, her expression a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "He's giving you a chance," she said. "Don't waste it." The groom nodded, standing up and turning to face the bride one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I hope someday, maybe." The bride offered a sad smile. "We'll see," she said softly. "Right now, you have more important things to focus on." With that, the boy, his father, and the grandmother left the hall together, stepping into the bright sunlight outside. It wasn't a perfect ending, and it wasn't wrapped up neatly like a fairy tale. But it was real. It was honest. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the beginning of something worth holding on to. Inside the now empty hall, the bride stood alone for a moment, her mind swirling with emotions. It wasn't the day she had dreamed of, but in her heart, she knew it was the right one. As she looked out at the sunlight streaming through the windows, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes love means letting go." And with that, she walked out, her head held high, ready to face whatever came next.